Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to a series of videos in which I am reading you a book. I am reading you Barchester Towers by Anthony Trollope. And we are up to Chapter 8, where hostilities have broken out. War has been declared, and hostilities have broken out in the close of Barchester Cathedral. Will it be controlled by Dr. Grantley and Mr. Harding and the old divines and deacons and subdeacons who've been running Barchester for 100 years? Or will it be taken over by the evil Mr. Slope, the new bishop's chaplain, who has made it clear in a sermon given from the pulpit of Barchester Cathedral that he intends to change everything about how they do things in Barchester. Not, we get the strong impression, because he wants it that way, but merely to show his domination. And we saw last time, the last chapter we saw that Dr. Grantley is marshalling the forces of the ecclesiastics at Barchester to resist Mr. Slope. And now we get a little bit, Chapter 8 gives us a domestic scene. Really our first one. It's called The Ex-Warden Rejoices in His Probable Return to the Hospital. And all of this is a callback to The Warden, which I read out loud with Mark at Book Time with Elvis and Micah Cummins last year. The first book in what became the Barchester series, where Dr. Harding, Mr. Harding, was the warden of a charitable hospital for 12 beadsmen that had been established by the will of a man named John Harum a long, long time ago, and provided, because the monies kept the value of the land kept increasing, it ended up providing the warden, who had a very comfortable living, with an enormous monthly annual salary. And John Bold, who's now dead, but who was the husband of Mr. Harding's daughter, raised a ruckus, got the newspapers involved, had a national to-do about this, these horrible, sponging, parasitical wardens who don't do anything and are reaping the benefits. And that caused Mr. Harding, who's a very sensitive soul, to resign. But, as we learned in the second chapter of this book, after all that to-do in the warden, the matter was put before Parliament, and Parliament decided to re-establish the hospital, re-establish the wardenship, add a new retirement home for elderly women, establish a matron, put it all under the control of and also reestablish money. Not as much money, but some money. And as we've now heard a few times in the course of Barchester Towers, everyone at Barchester, once they learned that news, just assumed that Dr. Harding would be reinstalled as the warden, even though he resigned. That's the grounding for this chapter, in case you didn't actually follow along with the warden. Although I'm sure that some enterprising soul out there has made a playlist of our read-along of The Warden, so there's no reason that you couldn't listen to it. All of you fans of audiobooks, there's no reason you couldn't do that. But anyway, let's read Chapter 8 together. Among the ladies in Barchester who have hitherto acknowledged Mr. Slope as their spiritual director must not be reckoned either the widow Bold or her sister-in-law. Keep in mind, Trollope has mentioned a few times, and he's going to mention it again. He's going to be obnoxious on the point that Obadiah Slope's rhetorical skills, such as they are, work well on women in a way that they don't work on men. It has nothing to do with attractiveness or glamour, because Mr. Slope is unattractive. He is not a glamorous figure. There's no out here. There's no way you can maneuver yourself around Trollope's sexism. You can't do it. I would argue that his sexism as a man and sometimes as a storyteller is redeemed to the point where you can just write it off as even by the magnificent female creations that he has given us in his novels. Some of the greatest female characters in all of English literature. And I would argue that wipes the slate clean. You might think differently, especially if you happen to be a woman. But anyway, that is what's being hinted at here, is that the women of Barchester are starting to fall under Mr. Slope's spell. But we're supposed to say here that Eleanor Bold and her sister-in-law absolutely are not. On the first outbreak of the wrath of the denizens of the close, none had been more animated against the intruder than these two ladies. And this was natural. Who could be so proud of the musical distinction of their own cathedral as the favorite daughter of the precentor? Why, who would be so likely to resent an insult offered to the old choir? And in such matters, Miss Bold and her sister-in-law had but one opinion. This wrath, however, has in some degree been mitigated, and I regret to say that these ladies allowed Mr. Slope to be his own apologist. About a fortnight after the sermon had been preached, they were both of them not a little surprised at hearing Mr. Slope announced. In other words, the servant comes and says he's at the door. As the page in buttons opened Mrs. Bold's drawing-room door. Indeed, what living man could, by mere morning visit, have surprised them more? Here was the great enemy of all that was good in Barchester coming into their own drawing-room, and they had no strong arm, no ready tongue near at hand for their protection. The widow Bold snatched her baby out of its cradle into her lap, and Mary Bold stood up ready to die manfully in that baby's behalf, should, under any circumstances, such a sacrifice become necessary. He's a horrible character, but he's not going to eat your baby. But anyway, in this manner was Mr. Slope received. But when he left, he was allowed by each lady to take her hand, and make his adieu as gentlemen do who have been graciously entertained. Yes, he shook hands with them, and was curtsied out courteously, the buttoned page opening the door as he would have done for the best canon of them all. Buttons meaning the pages are wearing a house uniform. That's what that means. He had touched the baby's little hand, and blessed him with a fervid blessing. He had spoken to the widow of her early sorrows, and Eleanor's silent tears had not rebuked him. He had told Mary Bold that her devotion would be rewarded, and Mary Bold had heard the praise without disgust. And how had he done all this? How had he so quickly turned aversion into, at any rate, acquaintance? How had he overcome the enmity with which these ladies had been ready to receive him, and made his peace with them so easily? My readers will guess that, from what I have written, that I myself do not like Mr. Slope. But I am constrained to admit that he is a man of parts. He knows how to say a soft word in the proper place. He knows how to adapt his flattery to the ears of his hearers. He knows the wiles of the serpent, and he uses them. Could Mr. Slope have adapted his manners to men as well as to women, could he have ever learnt the ways of a gentleman, he might have risen to great things. And Trollope has given us many examples of men who do learn to do that. They learn to dominate and flatter and cajole not only the weaker sex, routinely being outsold by 2 women while he was serializing this work. But nevertheless, you can't get through to some people. He was routinely being outsold by women when he was serializing this work. But Trollope has given us examples of male characters whose charisma or domination, for good or ill, works on everybody. Mr. Slope is not one of those. He commenced his acquaintance with Eleanor by praising her father. Surefire way for it to work. He had, he said, become aware that he had unfortunately offended the feelings of a man of whom he could not speak too highly. He would not now allude to a subject which was probably too serious for drawing-room conversation, but he would say that it had been very far from him to utter a word of disparagement of a man who, of all the world, at least the clerical world, spoke so highly as it did Mr. Harding. And so he went on, unsaying a great deal of his sermon, expressing his highest admiration for the presenter's musical talents, eulogizing father and daughter and sister-in-law, speaking in that low, silky whisper which he always had specially prepared for feminine ears, and, ultimately, gaining his object. When he left, he expressed a hope that he might again be allowed to call, and though Eleanor gave no verbal assent to this, she did not express dissent. Thus Mr. Slope's right to visit the widow's house was established. Oh, the serpent has wormed his way in. That the day after this visit, Eleanor told her father of it, and expressed an opinion that Mr. Slope was not quite so black as he had been painted. In other Trollope novels, maybe when he's feeling more of his oats, maybe when he's a little bit more accustomed to pleasing a very boisterous and growing audience, she maybe wouldn't tell her father. And that would be a source of dramatic tension that he would work like a hobby horse for 400 pages. But here she tells him, because she's devoted to it. Mr. Harding opened his eyes rather wider than usual when he heard what had occurred, but he said little. He could not agree in any praise of Mr. Slope, and it was not his practice to say much evil of anyone. He did not, however, like the visit, and simple-minded as he was, he felt sure that Mr. Slope had some deeper motive than the mere pleasure of making soft speeches to 2 ladies. Of course he does. Mr. Harding, however, had come to see his daughter with other purpose in mind than speaking of either good or evil of Mr. Slope. He had come to tell her that the place of warden at Hiram's Hospital was again to be filled up, and that in all probability he would once more return to his old home and his 12 beadsmen. But, he said, laughing, I shall be greatly shorn of my ancient glory. Why so, Papa? This new Act of Parliament that is to put us all on our feet again, continued he, settles my income at £450 per annum. 450, said she, instead of 800. Well, that is rather shabby, but still, Papa, you'll have the dear old house and garden. Keep in mind, a normal person like you or me is making £150 a year. This, and working for it, showing up at a counter, cracking wood, hauling loads. It was rather shabby that he's going to get 450 pounds to play the cello on the lawn once a week. Anyway, my dear, said he, is worth twice the money. And as he spoke, he showed a jaunty kind of satisfaction in his tone and manner, and in the quick, pleasant way in which he paced Eleanor's drawing room. It's worth twice the money. I shall have the house and garden and the larger income that I can possibly want. Picture, when you picture a house, don't picture a normal house here. Picture what you would consider to be an English manor, with lots of countryside around it. He is right. It's worth twice the money. It's an amazing living. At any rate, you'll have no extravagant daughter to provide for. And as she spoke, the young widow put her arm within his and made him sit on the sofa beside her. At any rate, you'll not have that expense. Keep in mind, that's supposed to be a mild kind of joke. This is supposed to be a very friendly, very warm meeting between father and daughter. No, my dear, I shall be rather lonely without her, but we won't think of that now. As regards income, I shall have plenty for all I want. I shall have my old house, and I don't mind owning now that I have felt sometimes the inconvenience of living in a lodging. Lodging is very nice for young men, but in my time of life there is a want of, I hardly know what to call it, perhaps not respectability. Most of us live in lodgings. Mr. Warden, most of us do. Oh, Papa, I'm sure there's been nothing like that. Nobody's thought of it. Nobody in all Barchester has been more respected than you since you took those rooms in High Street. Nobody, not the dean in his deanery or the archdeacon out at Plumstead. The archdeacon would not be much obliged if he heard you, he said, smiling somewhat at the exclusive manner in which your daughter confined her illustration to church dignities of the chapter of Barchester. But at any rate, I shall be glad to be back in the old house. Since I heard that it was all settled, I've begun to fancy that I can't be comfortable without my 2 sitting rooms. Come and stay with me, Papa, till it is settled. There's a dear Papa. Thank ye, Nellie, but no, I won't do that. It would make 2 movings, and I shall be very glad to get back to my old men again. Alas, alas, there have 6 of them gone in these last few years, 6 out of 12. And of the others, I fear, have had but a sorry life of it out there. Poor Bunce, poor old Bunce. Remember Bunce from the ward. Bunce was one of the surviving recipients of Hiram's charity, an old man now, over 90, who had long been a favorite of Mr. Harding's. How happy old Bunce will be, said Mrs. Bold, clapping her soft hands together. How happy they will all be to have you back again. You may be sure there will soon be friendship among them again when you are there. But, said he, half laughing, I am to have new troubles, which will be terrible to me. There are to be 12 old women and a matron. How shall I manage 12 old women and a matron? The matron will manage the women, of course. And who'll manage the matron? Said he. She won't want to be managed. She'll be a great lady herself, I suppose. But, Papa, where will the matron live? She's not to live in the warden's house with you, is she? Well, I hope not, my dear. Oh, Papa, I tell you fairly, I won't have a matron for a new stepmother. Keep in mind, this is all done banteringly. There's supposed to be laughter involved here. Trollope isn't telling you about the laughter, or the giggling, or the smiles, mostly, because he's assuming that you know that. The diction is 100 years old, so it may seem a little stiff, probably to your ears, if there were an author who were as talented as Trollope writing today, or 1/1,000,000th as talented as Trollope writing today, they would probably make a point of stage directing the laughter. But you're still supposed to hear it. This is somewhat silly talk on a serious subject. You shan't, my dear, that is, if I can help it, but they are going to build another house for the matron and the women, and I believe they haven't even fixed yet a site of the building. And have they appointed the matron? Said Eleanor. They haven't yet appointed the warden, said he. But there's hardly any doubt about that, I suppose, said his daughter. Mr. Harding explained that he thought there was no doubt, that the archdeacon had declared as much, saying that the bishop and his chaplain between them had not the power to appoint anyone else, even if they had the will to do so, and sufficient impudence to carry out such a will. The archdeacon was of the opinion that though Mr. Harding had resigned his wardenship, and had done so unconditionally, he had done so under the circumstances which left the bishop with no choice as to his reappointment, now that the affair of the hospital had been settled on a new basis by an act of Parliament. Such was the archdeacon's opinion, and his father-in-law received it without a shadow of doubt. Dr. Grantley had always been strongly opposed to Mr. Harding's resignation of the place. He had done all in his power to dissuade him from it. He had considered that Mr. Harding was bound to withstand the popular clamor with which he was attacked for receiving so large an income as $800 a year from such a charity, and was not yet satisfied that his father-in-law's conduct had not been pusillanimous and undignified. He looked also on this reduction of the warden's income as a shabby, paltry scheme on the part of the government for escaping from a difficulty into which it had been brought by the public press. Second use of the word shabby. Are we to think here that it's just Trollope being lazy, that he got that word in his mind and is using it a second time without thinking about it? Or are we to think from that Eleanor got her opinion of this from Dr. Grantley, her opinion of the whole situation? It's probably the first one. She appears to be learning about this for the first time in this chapter. Interesting to think about whenever you see words repeated in Trollope. Sometimes he just loves the word, so he'll just repeat it. He looked also on the reduction of the... Oh, right, we already did that. It's shabby and undignified. Where Dr. Grantley observed that the government had no more right to dispose of a sum of £450 a year out of the income of Hiram's legacy than of 900. Whereas, as he said, the bishops, dean, and chapter clearly had a right to settle what sum should be paid. He also declared that the government had no more right to saddle the charity with 12 old women than with 1,200. He was, therefore, very indignant on the matter. He probably forgot, when so talking, that the government had done nothing of the kind, and had never assumed any such might or any such right. He made the common mistake of attributing to the government, which is in such matters is powerless, the doings of Parliament, which in such matters is omnipotent. I myself don't really understand the ins and outs here, and I don't see why it isn't just a question of the See of Barchester. I don't see why any of this is a Parliament matter. But it's money being handed out from, I guess, what counts as public coffers. But though he felt that the glory and honor of the situation of the warden of Barchester Hospital was indeed curtailed by the new arrangement, that the whole establishment had to a certain degree been made vile by the touch of Whig commissioners, that the place with its lessened income, its old women, and other innovations was very different from the hospital of former days, still the Archdeacon was too practical a man of the world to wish that his father-in-law, who at present had little more than £200 a year for all his wants, should refuse the situation, defiled, undignified, and commission-ridden as it was. Mr. Harding had accordingly made up his mind that he would return to his old home at the hospital, and to tell the truth, had experienced almost childish pleasure at the idea of doing so. The diminished income was to him not even the source of momentary regret. The matron and old women did rather go against the grain, but he was able to console himself with the reflection that, after all, such an arrangement might be of real service to the poor of the city. The thought that he must receive his reappointment as a gift of the new bishop, and probably through the hands of Mr. Slope, annoyed him a little, but his mind was set at rest by the assurance of the Archdeacon that there would be no favor in such a presentation. The reappointment of the old warden would be regarded by all the world as a matter of course. Mr. Harding, therefore, felt no hesitation in telling his daughter that they might look upon his return to his old quarters as a settled matter. We're going to be getting to this. And you won't have to ask for it, Papa. Certainly not, my dear. There is no ground on which I should ask any favor from the bishop, whom, indeed, I hardly know. Nor would I ask a favor of the granting of which might possibly be made a question to be settled by Mr. Slope. No, he said, moved for a moment by a spirit very much unlike his own. I certainly shall be very glad to go back to the hospital, but I should never go there if it were necessary that my doing so should be the subject of a request to Mr. Slope. This little outbreak of her father's anger jarred on the present tone of Eleanor's mind. She had not learnt to like Mr. Slope, but she had learnt to think that he had much respect for her father, and she would, therefore, willingly use her efforts to induce something like good feeling between them. He's got in amongst them, right in their home. Oh, Papa, said she, I think you somewhat mistake Mr. Slope's character. Do I? He said placidly. I think you do, Papa. I think he intended no personal disrespect to you when he preached a sermon which made the Archdeacon and the Dean so angry. I never supposed he did, my dear. I hope I never inquired within myself whether he did so or not. Such a matter would be unworthy of any inquiry, and very unworthy of the consideration of the chapter. But I fear he intended the disrespect of the ministration of God's services as conducted in the conformity with the rules of the Church of England. But might it not be that he thought it his duty to express his dissent from that which you and the Dean and all of us here so much approve? It can hardly be the duty of a young man rudely to assail the religious convictions of his elders in the Church. Courtesy should have kept him silent, even if either charity or modesty could do so. But Mr. Slope would say that on such a subject the commands of his heavenly master do not admit of being silent. Nor of his being courteous, Eleanor? He did not say that, Papa. Believe me, my child, that Christian ministers are never called on by God's word to insult the convictions or even the prejudices of their brethren. the Our precentor, Mr. Harding, has obviously never read St. Paul. and that religion is, at any rate, not less susceptible of urbane and courteous conduct among men than any other study which men may take up. I'm sorry to say that I cannot defend Mr. Slope's sermon in the cathedral. But come, my dear, put on your bonnet, and let us walk round the dear old gardens at the hospital. I have never yet had the heart to go beyond the courtyard since we left the place. Now I think I can venture to enter. Eleanor rang the bell and gave a variety of imperative charges as to the welfare of the precious baby, whom, all but unwillingly, she was about to leave for an hour or so, and then sauntered forth with her father to revisit the old hospital. It had been forbidden ground to her as well as to him, since the day on which they had walked forth together from its walls. Okay, so that is the chapter, and it's a very neat little domestic scene. We learn catastrophically at the beginning of the chapter that Mr. Slope has actually had the courage to go into the heart of his enemy territory, to talk to Eleanor Bold, and win her over to such an extent that she feels like defending him to her father, who he has slandered above all men. He has attacked Mr. Harding. Mr. Harding is the precentor of the cathedral. He's in charge of the musical services. If you remember from the last chapter, the musical services were the core of Mr. Slope's criticism of everything that's done at Barchester. Of course he's attacking Mr. Harding. Nevertheless, at the beginning of the chapter, Mr. Slope makes his way among the women and has his Jedi mind tricks on their weak and feeble minds. This is one thing we associate with women. It's weak and feeble minds. Good. Anyway, once he's left, we get a domestic scene with Mr. Harding and his daughter, where they talk about the beloved Hiram's Hospital where they left. The Hiram's Hospital is a sprawling institution, sprawling grounds, beautiful house apportioned for the warden, beautiful gardens and trees and lawns and whatnot, and they haven't had the heart to go back there and walk around since then. They would, of course, be allowed to, but they haven't had the heart to do it since they left, since Mr. Harding left his place there. And here, at the end of the chapter, Mr. Harding is so happy at the thought of being returned to his old place, even reduced at half pay. He's so happy at being returned to his old place that he feels literally like going there and walking around just to look at it again in presentiment of when he will get to move his stuff from his lodgings over the chemist shop and go back to that lovely old house. And that point is made over and over and over again in this chapter. And what is the reason why Trollope does that? Why he makes that point over and over again? Dr. Grantley says it's settled. The dean says it's settled. Mr. Harding has been convinced that it is settled. He tells his daughter that it is settled. They agree that it is settled. She talks about it as though it is settled. They put on their bonnet and hat and go to tour the grounds because it is so settled that they want to reacquaint themselves with the place. What is the point of Trollope saying that over and over and over and over and over again? Of course, the point is that it's not settled. That is, of course, the point. He wants to cement that in your mind so that he can toss it out the window. And so we see, obvious. I mean, you know, as a reader, you know you're being manipulated. If everybody in the world is agreeing that nothing can possibly stop this from happening, then it isn't going to happen. And you know as a reader that you're being set up for that. So now we see the germ of another plotline. This novel has been a little bit strange among Trollope's novels, with the absence of any dueling plotlines. Nothing parallel, nothing to draw your attention away. Trollope was writing these things for serialization in periodical press. So were a lot of people. And those people understood that a whole bunch of readers might not be interested in one plot, but they would be interested in another. On a commercial level, it behooved you to have multiple plots that were very different from each other, moving forward at the same time. And it would be your job to figure out how to wind them all together at the end. But the point was that some of your readers wouldn't care about church politics. And so far, all we've had is church politics. The old bishop dies, a new bishop is appointed. He has an imperious personal chaplain who wants to run the diocese. The diocese is already under the official control of the man who hoped he would be the new bishop. That's a wonderful plot. These are terrific characters. Trollope is clearly enjoying himself. But it's only one plot, and it's only about that one thing, ecclesiastical infighting. With no human element, really no human element. I mean, yes, Mr. Slope and Dr. Grantley are at war, but anyone would be offended by Mr. Slope. That's the clear impression we're supposed to get about this odious, horrible character. So it really becomes just a turf war. Now we're going to get something more personal. You know this, I'm not spoiling anything, you know that if Trollope is going out of his way to tell you for 8 pages that this issue is settled, that means it's not settled. That means it's not settled. Which means someone else is going to be put forward for the wardenship, and that will introduce another plot, another level of personal complexity. So we'll see. We'll move on to the next chapter from there. Sorry about all the interpolated commentary here. You knew that when you married me. There's no way I can not do that. So this won't be a normal read aloud of a book. But anyway, we're going to wrap this up for now. We'll move on next time, and I will see you then. Thank you.